I'll give the floor to Isabelle. Thank you again, Isabelle, for participating today.
It's interesting because it's in English
And
and
you have
25%
the floor is yours.
Beaucoup, Pierre, but I will continue in English. So I'd like first to thank you for inviting me at this conference, which was at first a surprise for me, as I am not an academic, but I am a practitioner. But then I understood that to introduce a 2008 financial crisis is what you wanted a practitioner. And indeed, I was director of market operations at the Bank of France from 2001 to 2008, and in charge of monetary policy implementation and foreign exchange reserves management. So did central bankers see the crisis coming, and were they listening to the prophets? Before 2007, the mood within central banks of the developed economies, and especially at the Fed, was an excessive confidence in the future and in the fundamentals of the economy. Through Greenspan had spoken about irrational exuberance as early as 1996, but then he was called the maestro until the real estate bubble burst. True, also, some contrarians were speaking, in particular Rubini and Rajan. However, there was a kind of complacency in looking at their analysis, and there was no real buying. I can illustrate that mood of excessive confidence in the good functioning of the markets and economies by several examples. The first refers to the man that nobody wanted to hear, and I mean Bill White, the chief economist of the Bank for International Settlements, who was there from 1994 to 2008. And the BIS is, as you know, the bank of the central banks. Thanks to the huge BIS database, Bill pointed out very early the real estate bubble developing in the US. He also criticized the opaque securitization process and provided evidence of the lack of accuracy of rating agencies. Bill first kept his assessment private within the central bank circle and make it then public in the 2003 Jackson's Hole Symposium. Yet, he didn't get such support from his peers. At the Bank of France, we also had our internal prophet, the deputy governor who joined the BIS in 2005. He had constantly be a contradictor, alerting on Toulouse monetary and fiscal policies. I remember that he wrote an article just before he left titled, "The Market is Wrong." And as Rajan was criticized by Summers, the deputy governor has been criticized by his peers. It is true that before 2007, all markets were on a bull trend and volatility was remaining low. And I remember the governor of the Bank of France asking why? Why is it like this? And we couldn't really explain, but there was a feeling that at some point there will be a turnaround, what we call in French, le calme avant la tempête. By the way, in 2006, the Euro system, meaning the ECB and the national central banks, prepared for the first time to an adverse event. A big banking sector crisis simulation exercise was conducted in order to see if we were ready to act, or I should say, to react rapidly to a crisis. Maybe it was a kind of preliminary exercise. However, in May 2007, I was attending one of the bi-monthly BIS committees in Basel. Several central bankers, including myself, raised their concerns about the US real estate market. The answer by the Fed representative was quick. In history, US real estate prices have never declined. He was right, but that was his blunt way to tell us, I don't want to talk about that, everything is going well. And at that time, the motto was remaining so far, so good. It's only in September 2007 that the mood has shifted in the meetings, and the Fed representative delivered a totally different analysis. He expressed concerns since the first events announcing the crisis had occurred. Remember, it was early, even in February, HSBC announcing loss warning on some of their funds. In April, the bankruptcy of New Century, Bernstein also recording losses, and in August, BNP, which closed 3 investment funds, which were full of illiquid securitized assets that the bank was unable to price anymore. And this triggered a freeze of the interbank market, and central banks injected a lot of liquidity. Yet, many were still underestimated the risk created by the very small subprime market and the looming great financial crisis. These are personal practitioners' souvenirs, should not give the impression that most economists and central bankers are wrong. As usual, one rarely speaks about all the crises that were avoided by appropriate prior actions by regulators and central bankers. Neither should we forget that prophets, as highlighted in Pierre's paper, rarely give a precise timing when predicting crises. And if you constantly predict bad outcomes, at some point you become right, as there will always be crises. But to conclude, as Bill Watt said, as long as everything goes well, there is a great reluctance to make any kind of change. This is deeply rooted in the humankind. And I will.
Eric Monet, can I? Do you want to introduce the speakers?
If you want me, I mean, I can do that extremely briefly, just saying who they are and what is their current position. But I think that what would be most interesting is that they tell us then what was their position before the crisis, and I expect that many will also tell us how the position has changed, including maybe their professional status from before and after the crisis. But yeah, just as a brief introduction, we have, as you already said, Pierre, there are 4 speakers today. Steve Keen will, if I'm not mistaken, will speak first. And Steve is an economist at the University College of London. And Paul Jorion was an anthropologist, sociologist, who is at the Catholic University of Lille, and Anne Petitfort, who is an economist also at the University of London, and Marc Faber, financial analyst, who will conclude this session. So I let the floor first to Steve.
I was one of the handful of economists who was credited with seeing the crisis coming. And I don't see that as me as being prescient, but me not wearing the blinkers that the rest of the economics profession has welded onto their faces fundamentally from first-year economics on. And this gives us what I see as the blindness of economics. And this is not something which is just limited to the economics profession. I'm quoting now from Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions. And he points out that when you are doing normal science, which he defines as having an existing paradigm extending its field of relevance, then somebody who goes into that field knows what they want to do and knows the tools to use it and knows what they want the outcome to be. Finding that reality is not the outcome you get, is not what they expect, and they're going to go against, they're going to resist that discovery. On the other hand, when you have an anomaly between the existing paradigm and the new one, then you become the new one by resolving that anomaly. That's the process of science. It does not, unfortunately, occur in economics. If you look at, just put this back in the previous crisis, back in the 1930s, Bernanke was applying what you see as normal science, the current paradigm, neoclassical economics, to dismiss Irving Fisher's debt deflation theory of the Great Depression. And he basically said that debt is just a redistribution of spending power from one person to another. And without big differences in their spending capacities, there'd be no significant macroeconomic effects. And when you then look at the conventional theory of money, which is loanable funds, which is still taught by textbooks and still promoted by people like Paul Krugman, then credit disappears, and I'll show you that analytically later. On the other hand, Minsky did comprehend Fisher, and he began by saying, to explain how a crisis comes about, you must explain how debt creates additional spending power. And he finally makes this point here, there must be some way that borrowing money adds to spending power with one person without diminishing it in others. There must be that mechanism. Now, if you look at the views of money, the dominant view is still the neoclassical view that money is irrelevant fundamentally to macroeconomics, except for the rate of inflation, where this is based on the idea that banks can't create money. But the reality that they can is common to post-Keynesian economics. And that was what was in Minsky and what I also built upon. And when I built a model of Minsky, taking Goodwin's model as a foundation and adding finance to it, I had this strange effect in the simulation of the cycles diminishing before they then exploded into a crisis. And I ended with this, what I thought was a rhetorical flourish, saying that we should not treat a period of tranquility as anything other than a lull before the storm. Nice way to finish in our paper, I thought. Then it started to happen, as you saw in those previous sets of slides. On the other hand, neoclassicals took the diminishing volatility of the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s as a sign that they were doing the right thing. And here you have Bernanke talking about this signal of a diminishing cycles being a welcome change to the economy. Now, my reaction, having built that model, was that it's a harbinger of a crisis. And it wasn't the sort of crisis which Minsky spoke about, instability is destabilizing. That was explaining how you could get to the recovery after a slump and then have another boom. That was a single cycle. This is what's called a strange tractor. And when you look at the dynamics, what's actually going on here, that diminishing cycles and then rising cycles was first discovered in fluid mechanics, in analyzing Lorenz's equations of chaotic turbulent motion in fluids. So my model actually is the same camp as Lorenz's model in terms of generating cyclical instability. And what I'm showing you here is a simulation of a model, my model of Minsky, but derived directly from macroeconomic definitions. And what you'll see in that model is a very stylized form of what actually happened in the global economy over the last 30 to 40 years. You had a rising level of private debt, which was ignored by the mainstream economists. You had diminishing cycles in growth and inflation, which they took the credit for. And you had a declining share of income going to workers, because what's actually happening here is a rising share of income going to bankers. And then it all looks like it's settling down to a nice little equilibrium, which is the sort of thinking that neoclassical economics encourages. And suddenly those cycles start to get larger. Now that is incomprehensible from a neoclassical point of view, but it's what happens in complex systems with nonlinear, structural nonlinearities between essential elements of the system. So we're seeing this turning up here. And what looks like the classic stability is destabilizing, not just of a single cycle, but of the actual outcome of capitalism, looks like it's taking you to nirvana, and otherwise you're on your way to hell, because the cycles start to get larger and larger, and ultimately the level of private debt overwhelms the economy, and you have a collapse. So back to the simulation, back to the presentation. What's going on there? First of all, this is a profit-driven model. So profit determines investment, investment determines economic output. If you're above a target rate of profit, then capitalists borrow money. So investment exceeds profit, which is where change in debt comes from. That investment causes a boom, and that leads to rising employment over time, meaning that wages get higher still with the Phillips curve effect, and a rising level of debt to GDP because you're borrowing more money and you are therefore paying interest payments on that. Now, ultimately, those two effects of more money going to workers and bankers cuts into profits, leave less to invest, investment becomes less than profits. Then you pay off some debt and you have rising unemployment, meaning the wages share falls, and the boom restarts when you get back to the target profit rate. But at that point, there's been a shift in the residual of income. If you have income minus profits, the residuals are workers' wages and bankers' share. With the extra level of debt, more is going to bankers, less is going to workers. So it's actually the workers who pay for the debt in terms of income, even though they're doing none of the borrowing. And the cycle then recommences, and you see what happens going on until such time as the compounding of the interest on debt exceeds how much wages can be reduced once you get past a critical level of debt to GDP. So that's what's actually going on there. So I had that in my mind. I wrote my PhD. This is my PhD model, finished in 98. Then I got involved in heavy teaching load at a low-ranking university, which is the only sort of place that a non-orthodox economist can get a job. Wrote Debunking Economics, responded to the critics, and I didn't follow up in the debt and GDP until 2005, when I was asked to be a witness in a court case on predatory lending. And I looked at the data and I saw we're in for another crisis here. And in writing my presentation, I showed these two graphs. The top is both the aggregate data for debt to GDP for the USA and the various subgroups, so consumer credit, business, et cetera, but down here is my Minsky model. And I'm looking at the cycles here and saying, they look a bit like this. And when I realized that, my model was coming through in the real data. So I began warning in the media as best as I could, and also via blog. And at one point I was talking about why I was not cheering Australia's economic numbers. And my point was that you can't have a continuation of normal when normal involves an unsustainable trend in debt. And at some point that'll turn around, and we'll have a crisis. And I was writing blog posts like this and being extensively quoted in the Australian media. And I managed to change Australian economic policy for the worse, because I was, this is on the premier television show, television current affairs in Australia, a top class program with a top class journalist. I was asked by the host my opinions, and the next day he interviewed the Prime Minister, and he harried the Prime Minister about my views. And at the end of it, the government 1 week later came out with a stimulus program that involved trebling the amount of money the government gave to first-home buyers, which restarted the housing bubble. Okay, so that was my policy success. Okay, the exact opposite of what I wanted to see as sensible policy. And I had no impact upon mainstream economics, despite the fact that it failed to anticipate the crisis and the overwhelming empirical evidence that exists against their proposition. Now, you remember I quoted earlier Bernanke saying that there should be no significant macroeconomic effects from change in debt. That's the correlation of change in debt to the unemployment rate in America for the last 30 years. It's minus 0.82. I don't need to prove the significance of that deviation from zero. Now, how on earth do you survive a prediction which is that bad in science? And the reason is crises like this, even though they're monumental from our experience, are transient, whereas a crisis of an experimental prediction contradicting a theory in physics remains until physics develops a new theory. We forget the crisis in economics. The old guard converts a new bunch of incoming students to the utopian vision it has of capitalism, and you don't have the success that real sciences have, or as Max Planck put it, science advances one funeral at a time. So I think I'm running short on time here, Pierre. You better warn me if I do. Okay.
You're fine.
Sorry?
You're fine.
Oh, good. Okay. Now, what do they do when the data stuffs them up and they're trying to take on rival theories? They don't want to avoid changing the paradigm. It's probably my favorite example of paradigmatic stupidity from an economist, because here is Leo Harnian, who's a major collaborator with Edward Prescott, who gave us real business cycle models, which are the basis of DSGE models these days. He said, we need a theory as to why the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure was so low relative to the marginal product of labour. That is an explanation which predicates the belief that you can only explain what happens at the macroeconomy by microeconomics. Now, you look at him, what did he say about the financial causes of the financial crisis? And he said, well, people say there's been a significant contraction in intermediation services, not banking or debt, okay, intermediation services. He said, but you look at some measures of that, they haven't declined substantially. And figure 4, for example, shows bank credit to relative to nominal GDP rose to an all-time high and then declined a bit, but was still higher than before 2008. Now, this is the chart he's talking about. And I wonder, this passed not just his mind, but the referees and the editor of the journal who published this. What he thinks is credit is actually debt. If credit was 2 times GDP, then the debt to GDP ratio would be close to infinity by now. It's misunderstanding a stock for a flow. Now, why? Well, it's because they don't have a paradigm that understands why these things have a role. Now I'm showing you his, Hannigan's data is in the background there. This is the long-term version of the data he's working with, in the red line showing the level of private debt compared to GDP. And the blue line below it is the rate of change of the level of debt divided by GDP. And that's what he should have been looking at. That's actually credit, not intermediation, but credit. And there we have 1 time, 2 times, and 3 times where that stayed substantially below negative credit. That's what caused the great crises in America's history and in capitalism as well. Now, I've spent the last, 15 years making this case. And I know I'm never going to be taken seriously by the economics mainstream. And I now tell my students, don't even learn economics. Find a university teaching system dynamics and then extend what I've done here. So I hope, again, I'm doing okay on time, Pierre. I don't have a clock in front of me. First of all, we want to develop economics outside economics, because economics itself is hostile to the sorts of developments we need to see change. So what I've done in my work is establish the role of credit in macroeconomics and then show how you can use system dynamics, not equilibrium thinking, as a foundation for modeling. So first of all, the role of credit in aggregate demand. We all know the income is identical to expenditure identity. I use that and divide the economy into 3 sectors, and I show expenditure by each sector on the horizontal, and therefore net income on the vertical. And the negative sum of this matrix is the aggregate expenditure, and the positive sum of the off diagonal is aggregate income, and they are by definition, by necessity, equal to each other. So if I show this for household services and manufacturing, let's say, I'm showing households spending $8 per year on services and B dollars per year on manufacturing, and then services C dollars per year on households, call that wages, D dollars per year on manufacturing, et cetera, et cetera. If you add up the horizontal, the trace, and take the negative, you get A minus, et cetera, minus blah, blah, blah. You get exactly the same thing for aggregate income. That's just showing the basic logic. Now, if you look at how neoclassicals think about money, they see the bank as being an intermediary. So I'm imagining here the service sector as the saver and the household sector as the borrower. So there's a transfer of credit dollars per year across this way and less spending possible in this direction by services. And you work it out, credit disappears. This is the cancellation of credit that neoclassicals think describes the real world. But if you look at the real world, and the Bank of England done us an enormous favor by saying the textbooks are wrong, banks create money when they lend. I now include the banking sector, and when the households borrow from the banking sector, they increase their debts on one side of the ledger, they increase their assets on the other, which is the credit, but they then spend that in manufacturing. It's a bit like imagine your credit card being the basis of the transfer here. Then when you do the mathematics there, you find credit is part of aggregate expenditure and aggregate income. And that is omitted by mainstream neoclassical economics. It's no wonder they don't understand capitalism. Now, the other flat fallacy they've had is believing you've got to have micro foundations to build a theory of macroeconomics, and how hard work this is going to be to go from this micro foundation to a decent model. But where else can you start? Well, this is actually what physicists realized about half a century ago, was the fallacy of constructionism, the belief you have to build a high level of analysis from its low level foundation. I'll let you read the paper by Anderson at leisure at some point, but this breaks down when you have both scale and complexity. The behavior of large and complex aggregates is not to be understood in terms of a simple extrapolation of the properties of its constituents. At each level, you get new complexities, new fundamental research, and that applies to macroeconomics as well. So it's possible to take macroeconomic definitions. I call lambda the employment rate, number of people with the job divided by population, omega the wages share, wage divided by GDP, D the debt ratio, debt divided by GDP. I have output employment ratio and a capital output ratio. If you differentiate the first three, you get dynamic statements of those definitions. The employment rate will rise if economic growth exceeds the sum of the change in output of labour ratio and population growth. The wages share will rise if wages grow faster than GDP, and private debt will rise if debt grows faster than GDP. Those are still definitional statements. You add a few simplifying assumptions, and what you get is the model I've just shown you a moment ago, Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. So you can actually derive macroeconomics from macro foundations. You don't need micro foundations. And that's just a very simple model. You can go further and include prices and nonlinear investment functions and a whole range of other structural realities of the economy, and you will get a more realistic model. And we also need tools that let us analyze a monetary system properly, which is what I've been showing you there in the background by Minsky software. So that's my position, and I'm sticking with it. I'll stop now, Pierre, because I'm worried about going over time, so I hope that was okay.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you. It was dense and rich, and I hope we can comment on that later. Can you stick around until the end of the session? Okay, good.
Yeah, sure.
Now we have Paul Jorion.
Pierre and we agreed that because it won't be translated into French, that I would give us a brief summary in French of what I intend to say. And what I intend to say is the following, is that to me, that term of profit is a polemical, oh pardon, j'ai dit que je le dirais en français pour commencer. Voilà, en français, un rapide sommaire de ce que je vais dire en anglais parce qu'il n'y aura pas de traduction de l'anglais au français. En fait, le terme prophète utilisé pour l'ensemble des personnes qu'on entendra aujourd'hui, c'est un terme polémique, c'est une manière de remettre en question la validité de ce qu'ils ont à dire. Et d'une certaine manière, Steve Kahn, avec son premier exposé, il a déjà montré pourquoi. C'est parce qu'il y a quelque chose qui s'appelle la science économique et qui ne comprend pas ce qui fonctionne, ce qui marche en économie. Et par conséquent, il est essentiel, si on veut comprendre comment ça marche, à quelques exceptions près, comme le modèle de Minsky dont il a parlé, il faut se situer en dehors de la science économique. Et là, les économistes doivent se tenir un certain discours, ils doivent vous appeler par un nom, et ce nom, ils ne peuvent pas vous appeler charlatan, ils ne peuvent pas vous appeler dingo, etc., parce que vous avez des titres universitaires, parce que vous avez des grosses thèses dans un domaine ou dans un autre, mais ils doivent essayer de mettre ça entre parenthèses, et quand je dis la science économique, c'est également les syndicats patronaux, parce que dans une crise comme celle-là, c'est essentiellement eux qui sont remis en question, et j'expliquerai ça en anglais. Okay, now I turn to English. What I said briefly is that to me, that term of profit applied to us is a polemical term meant essentially to try to dismiss, to disqualify to some extent what we say. And why? For two main reasons. Because what we say is not good for business. It's not good for the business milieu. And it's not good for the creature of the business milieu, which is called economics and Nobel Prizes in economy and so on. They're quite embarrassed by the fact that it is people from essentially either from outside the field or people who build up on what were already kind of mavericks within the field, like Minsky. It's no accident that I built some of my prediction on Minsky as well as Steve did. Why is he somewhat outside? Well, because he's a Keynesian and he went on Keynes. And why was Keynes himself an outsider? Because he didn't study economics. He followed a course of 8 weeks in economics. He was a philosopher by training and a mathematician. And he had to essentially produce a theory of probability that showed that none of what economics professors say about our ability to predict what will happen, he had already dismissed it before he even started being in economics. Also, he had that wonderful seminar with Joan Robinson, with Pierre Schraffra and a number of other people who were little geniuses that helped him with great idea to push. So that's the framework. Myself, I don't come from economics. My background into economics is being an economic anthropologist. And that meant that I went to work into a small community of fishermen to start with. I did the fishing 1.5 years with them, and I produced a thesis which was called The Economics of the Island of What off the coast of Brittany. And in order to do that, the only time I tried to resort to proper economics theory was in order to assess, to do some assessment of my data for prices for the catch. And I was quite naive. I imagined that the law of supply and demand would work, and that didn't work. Cournot's theory of supply and demand, that didn't work at all. I turned to Marxism to see whether I could find anything better to explain my data. And I had to backtrack entirely to go to a paper by one of the founders of economic anthropology, Karl Polanyi, who went in the 1950s work on the on Aristotle's model of price formation, and that worked perfectly. And not only that, but when I moved in finance in 1990, where I started working and worked for 18 years in banks at headquarters, essentially in the prime, in the subprime sector when I was in the United States, I could as well use that model to, Aristotle's model, to explain price formation. Also, I had, of course, my background as having trained as an anthropologist altogether. I mean, outside also from economic anthropology. Also, I was trained as a sociologist. And in addition, which was not, which was relevant too, I had a training as a psychoanalyst, and that helped me work through the banking system survive for 18 years. That meant that when I started working, and that was somewhat accidental that I started working, my first job in the United States was in the subprime sector in a very, very small little bank. Then I moved into Alt-A. Alt-A is a kind of mixture. It's something in between the prime business, mortgage lending, and the subprime, with IndyMac Bank in Pasadena. I worked there essentially on the financial models. We developed an automated system so that people could enter all their data, and 10 seconds later, they would have a decision about whether they were allocated a loan or not, and what would be the loan amount, and what would be the interest to pay. And that was all from data being fed in real time from the stock exchange, from the prices at which the securities, the MBSs and the ABSs were priced on the market. So it's essentially, I had some training that I could use, economic anthropology, and then I worked on the job in the main pieces of the business. I finished my career in banking as being a part of the risk management, believe it or not, risk management department of Countrywide Financial, who everybody knows is the main actor in the downfall. But that was deliberate at that point. At that point, I had just stopped working in prime sector with Wells Fargo in San Francisco, and I became really thrilled by what was going on, and I wanted to get a job at Countrywide. I kind of infiltrate, I would say. I started in different departments, and I applied to all the positions I could see at Countrywide because I wanted to be there. And of course, it allowed—
As an anthropologist.
I beg your pardon?
As an anthropologist.
As an anthropologist, yeah.
I'm very impressed.
Thank you. And what is interesting is that my colleagues, they all knew I was an anthropologist. And at some point, even in Pasadena, I organized a little evening where I invited my colleagues, because there was nobody else to invite, as far as anthropologists were concerned, to have them listen to my views about a history of science altogether, and so on. It was very funny. But at all points, they knew I was an anthropologist. And they could also guess it by the fact that I would, when dealing with subprime cases and things of that type, I would go and see who were the people. I went to the censuses. I went to all the files of the people who were in private bankruptcy and so on, to find out what was going on. So I could bump into things that people were not aware of in the banking system, like a modification in the terms of personal bankruptcy in the United States and so on. So that was about predicting. I started writing about what I was seeing. It was not from models like Steve did. It was just being in the field, or seeing what was going on. We could see that we were going right into the wall. We could see also that the systems, our risk management systems, were flawed. They didn't respond as we expected. There were major flaws in the models. It was not of my capacity to be a financial model tester. And one day I come up at Countrywide. So we were, let's say something like 2005. I see our model for the price of real estate. And I realized that the model, because it's using somewhere an absolute value, it can't go into negative. It can't show that the prices might come down. So I tell that to my boss. He said, "Well, it's not important. It never goes down. So there's no issue about that." But there were major flaws. There were major flaws also in the piping of the securities. We had the abstract models of how a security would work, that it would be entirely safe because there was over collateralization. But sometimes the pipes were not even there. And then the answer was the same. Oh, we will never need to. This is very complicated. We'll never need that. It will never be necessary. And what we were in 2006 or something like that. Why dismiss when you start then telling what was going on? There's a number of, I would say, normal responses from people. First, it's bad news. Nobody likes bad news, and so people around you try to dismiss it. It's only the short sellers. The short sellers listen to you because they think maybe there's some point where they can get into that, and the famous Michael Lewis book about Big Short and the film that was made about that shows that there were indeed some people who would listen to what we were saying, but that was in order to make money from the downfall. And the other thing is, of course, is the business world that doesn't like that at all. In the first analysis, let's say 2005, 2006, I was already calling the attention on the responsibility of the Mortgage Bankers Association and what was going on. They were putting a lot of money. That was part of my job. That was not about being an anthropologist. It was that I was at INDIMAC. They asked me to look at what the Mortgage Bankers Association was doing. They were a member of it, and to assess its strategy. It was putting a lot of money. I think it initially was like $5 million into promoting research that would show that the law of Northern Carolina that was forbidding subprime loans, that it was actually detrimental for people of minorities. And they were actually giving money to a number of places in order that these places would actually, sociology department, whatever, so that they would show through their reports that forbidding subprime loans was detrimental to the Black community and to the Hispanic community. Actually, the three reports I read were very fair. They were showing that on the reverse, that it was good for them, that they were protected against predatory loans. But then what did the Mortgage Bankers Association do? They put their money into something else, to lobbying that other states in the United States who were considering getting that same law as Northern Carolina, that would be prevented from doing. And in the end, when everything collapses in 2008, there's still only Northern Carolina because the ABS has been successful. The Canadians have been very proud that they never had a subprime mortgage crisis, but that's because their law was identical to that of Northern Carolina. So people don't like you to do that, to say that. I mean, that's the main theme of the of Oreskes and Conway's book, The Merchants of Doubt. People will put money in order to shut you up, and calling you imposter or a prophet as part of the strategy. But the main thing, I think, is what I said in the beginning, which is the exact same point as Steve is saying. There is something, there is a scam. It's called economics. It's called science. It calls itself a science. It doesn't describe what's going on. It's off the mark. Sometimes it uses some little bits here and there that they can, I would say, recycle from Keynes, maybe even from Marxism, but we need to build something outside. And I think it's nice we have an event like here, because we see what it means to being prophet. We are here to promote a different paradigm, and that's the paradigm that will be one day the proper economics, the proper science of economics, but it's not being done by the people inside. And even so, I mean, they're putting a lot of their efforts in trying to undermine a proper representation of things. Thank you.
I wanted to maybe ask Eric sorry, Eric, to put you in that situation, but do you have comments to offer at this point, about the two first presentations, and also about what Isabelle told us about her experience at the Banque de France?
So yeah, I can definitely jump in. I'm glad to do it, and I thank you very much, Pierre, for the invitation. So my perspective here is one of an economic historian. So the thing I can say that what we are discussing today is clearly not something which is new or specific to 2008 crisis. I think in most crises that occurred, I mean, whether financial crisis or also even if we will extend that to political crisis, there will be some people who have foreseen this kind of events, and sometimes they are called Cassandra. And I think that the way to name these people, I think, is very important. I mean, Paul Jorion has just make a thing that prophet was maybe not a good term, especially because it's used in a negative sense by the opponents. Steve, I think, used the term Cassandra, but I think the way he used the term Cassandra was also in kind of negative sense, because he used it describing is a specific event when he made these comments who were used by the public TV or radio, I don't remember exactly, and then the way that the policymakers in Australia use that. So it's in fact more of this peculiar position where the policymakers in Australia took his discourse and turned it in a weird way that make it a Cassandra. But before that, he was, more someone that was trying to explain what was going on, and I'm something like Cassandra, like just like sending prophecies in the air. So I think that indeed the way the just specific names to be used are very important. And when I was listening to these two contributions, I was thinking that in a way, what could be more appropriate, especially given the two specific contributions we just heard, was maybe the one of whistleblowers. Because what was striking to me when I heard that is that in these two discourses, it's not that Paul or Steen were talking, by themselves, just like having their views coming from, a different thinking that the mainstream thinking. That also that they were writing against people, that they knew that at was times their discourses was going against the mainstream, against the wind, and their speeches, their discourses were not well perceived by some people. So they were kind of maybe, I don't know whether insiders. I mean, in the case of Paul, I think that the term insider can really be used because he was in finance, but even in the terms of team, I mean, he was an insider of academia, and in academia, there were this conflict. And I think that also what they did is just like to show I would say the public. I mean, people who do not have direct access to whether academic cycles, discussion in academic cycles, or knowledge of the financial of the financial institutions and the financial cycles. That something wasn't not going well, and I think it's true not only in the specific case of finance. It's true that given what we've heard from Paul, that something was not going well in the financial industry, and that it was important that some people were saying to the world that there was something not going on, and actually people inside the industry understood that there were some weird practices and malfunctionings. And I think even in the case of Steve Keen, I think that in a way his role was a kind of whistleblower to say that some mainstream economics was not able to grasp with the reality. So maybe if they want, since we have more time than expecting, maybe they want to also to comment on this and maybe to go along this discussion on how to call their own position that they endorse before the crisis.
I think that's a very good characterization, by the way, being a whistleblower against a profession, because of course, what a whistleblower does is expose fraud inside an organization which has the outward veneer of respectability. And that's precisely what neoclassical economics does. It's perpetrating frauds, 99% of the time, not even being aware that they are frauds, because they're just within their paradigm. But perpetrating frauds, and people like myself saying, this can't be trusted. People outside, you trust these people, you shouldn't trust them. Now, of course, the financial crisis was the first instance where I got a chance to say that loudly. I regret to say that I've been given an even better chance to say it about climate change. So I haven't got a link. I'll bring it up a link shortly in my screen. But I read in detail William Nordhaus's work, and fraud would not be too strong a word to use to describe what went on in assembling what he called data about climate change. So I'll put the link up to that paper shortly. But yes, you're right. I'm whistleblowing on a very, very so corrupt that it doesn't know it's corrupt profession.
Yeah, maybe I can comment on this also, because I understand the word prophet is controversial. The reason why I've used this term, for this symposium, it's simply because it's used in the public debate, including among people who actually enjoy your work. So that's one thing. And also the other thing is, and I don't want to go into too much details, but if you go back to classical sociology, to Max Weber, his work on prophets, so religious prophets, the term prophet is not negative in religion. If you read the work of Max Weber, you realize that actually the religious prophets are forces of rationalization. That's what he called them. Because the prophets are those who identify contradictions in the scriptures. The prophets are those who actually perceive, limits, inconsistencies in the way people interpret or make sense of scriptures. And the prophets are those who actually try to reform, change the scriptures. And, I might be the only one, you have to be a trained sociologist to actually know that the term prophet is actually not negative at all. But I like this term, and I really thank Eric Monet also to bring that point, because I don't really know what other term we could use. Personally, I like the term contrarian economist, but I don't know if you like this term. What do you think about this term, contrarian economist? I don't know. It doesn't sound like it.
I think you're correct in the sense that prophecy, what you're doing is getting us to rethink what a prophet means. Because what we see a prophet ourselves these days is, Noah and all this sort of stuff, all reference back to Jesus and the Bible and so on, or Muhammad if you're a Muslim and so on. What you're saying fundamentally is people who were called that were people who predicted something catastrophic most of the time that happened. And then after the event, people start, he was a prophet. So in that sense, it's quite an apt term to use right now, which is actually very, very, very good for me, but also depressing, because what I prophesize, courtesy of about how economists let us neglect climate change, is a pretty bad catastrophe.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, of course.
Pierre, I think that there are alternatives to that. There are alternatives to whistleblower. There are alternatives to prophets, and they're well known. They are a reformer, and there is a revolutionary, and I guess. I mean, if you look at it, and what happened, and with the 12 years, the hindsight that we have now, I think it was more like reformers. The reform has not managed to exist, and maybe it will be with hindsight. It will be maybe what this particular conference will achieve is that something like a group of people who are the proper reformers of economics would come together and get some recognition. The difficulty is in the recognition by whom. There's so much money that has been put in building that so-called economics, Société du Mont Pèlerin, and then the Nobel Prize. Who would actually support that a new paradigm emerges and really takes over? I can't see anybody who's got any interest really, who has any money, would have any interest. Maybe Soros. That's all to do something like this. The fact is that time is running out, and we need to start being able. We can't have more blunders like Blanchard with his wrong assignation of a particular coefficient, and then that decides whether it's austerity or where you a major boom. I mean, this is too dangerous. But of course, there are too many interests linked. And one thing I'll tell you, I was interviewed, of course, and when in 2009, let's say, and people would say, so who's responsible for the crisis? And I would say, well, it's the Mortgage Bankers Association, and I would explain what I just explained. And at the end of the interview, it would always be the same. The person who had interviewed me would say, oh, well, in that case, we don't know if anybody is responsible. It was not even deliberate, but it came automatically. If you say it's a group of business people who put a lot of money in it, then it's just the same as saying that nobody knows how it works.
But on this, I think it's also very important to assess that. I mean, there were people within institutions that were understanding that something wrong was going on before the crisis. I mean, Isabelle Isabelle Strauss-Kahn has given some examples at the Bank of France, at the Bank of International Settlements. There is a well-known example of who was also mentioned of Raghuram Rajan making remarks at Jackson Hole. There were also the other examples, who is often called a Cassandra of Edward Gramlich at the Federal.
Exactly. Yeah, there was somebody at the the Fed who was saying the same. Unfortunately, Gramlich's book came out in mid 2008, so he wasn't prophet at all. I mean, maybe he thought it, but the book came when it was nearly over. Yeah.
But I think it's important to recognize that this kind of discourse were also within institutions, and so to understand why within institutions they were not listened or understood on this, it's still not clear to me on how, because it's not these are not places where, I mean, these people were not censored. I mean, they could, the only fact in that case is that they did not speak loudly outside of these cycles, but these people were not censored. They did not have, it was not a debate where big money was, all over the place. I mean, you see that within institutions, so it's not, there was no lobbyist involved or something like this, at least in the internal debate. So I think it's also very important to understand, what was the rhetoric that was explaining that these people were wrong. And I think it goes back to the presentation of Strauss-Kahn on all the rhetoric of the Great Moderation, which was saying that all what was happening was normal. And I think it's also important to see this conflict between these two kind of rhetoric and who are the people who are saying that the things are just normal. But I just seen that Anne PT4, I think, has joined us.
Yes. Hello, Anne.
Apologies if I'm late. There was a misunderstanding. I'm so sorry.
I may have contributed to that, Anne, did I?
No, it's entirely my own incompetence, I'm afraid.
Well,
okay.
That's fine. It's better late than never. And thank you for being here. Just to give you a little recap, we had, so Steve Keen just spoke first, and then Paul Jorion came second. I don't know if you guys know each other, by the way. I mean, I think Steve and Anne, I don't know.
We're old pals. We're both from, what is it called, Steve? From the South.
Yeah, we've shared the odd carry, Anne.
Yeah, but he's from Australia, I'm from South Africa, and, we come to the strange country in the north together.
Yeah.
Put it. Well, without further ado, I'll give you the floor, Anne, if you don't mind. Okay. And then we'll have Marc Faber, who has yet to, that was scheduled. He told me he would be online at 3:20. So I really hope it's going to work.
Good. Fantastic.
Thank you, Anne, again. And you have the floor.
So much. And I was thinking about how to present this, and without sounding, and I don't know if Steve managed this, without sounding my own trumpet and sounding like I'm very self-satisfied. I think that the lesson that I have and the experience that I have had can be traced very clearly to my work. So I was working on the sovereign debt of the poorest countries, of the low-income countries, for 10 years from 1990 onwards. And I had therefore the privilege, if you like, of going outside of my own country. And I worked in Africa a great deal, which is where I was born. But I moved across the continent, which is huge, as we all know. And I worked in Washington in the United States with the IMF and the World Bank, in France with the Paris Club. I wouldn't call that working with, but we coordinated with the Paris Club, and in Japan, because Japan, of course, was such a very big creditor. So I found myself, and of course, in Latin America as well. So I had this sort of, if you like, eagle eye view of the world, but I was looking at it very much from the perspective of the low-income countries, looking up at the world, looking at how unfair it was and how unjust the system of sovereign debt restructuring is. It's completely loaded, the dice are loaded entirely in favor of the creditors. And the debtor is made to make the major adjustments, to bear the burden of the major adjustment any debt restructuring. And the injustice of the international system, for me, contrasted dramatically with the way in which the bankruptcy laws operate inside Western countries for commercial organizations, where it is just recognized that there will be years when the warehouse will burn down, when the debtor will not be able to repay, and when actually to extract payment from the debtor is a kind of injury, really. And in Western society, in Western commercial law, that was recognized at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, with the introduction of bankruptcy law, which recognized that putting the debtor in prison in the way that Charles Dickens's father was put in Marshalsea prison doesn't enable the debtor to participate in economic activity, doesn't enable the debtor to repay the debt. Instead, it makes it worse. It withdraws the debtor from the economic system and actually effectively withdraws demand and activity. And those legislators had the vision and the wisdom to understand that it was necessary to bring the debtor back into the economy, to accept no blame, and to distribute fairly the burden of adjustment between creditor and debtor. That doesn't happen in the international sphere. So I was very preoccupied with that and viewing the world from the perspective of these low-income countries. And at the end of the campaign, which ended in the millennium year, when the G8 began to make major decisions to write off about $100 billion of debt, I came back to England more or less to retire. I was exhausted. It had been very exhausting working at an international level, traveling so much, being in Lima one day and Tokyo the next, and then back to Washington, then over to London. It was really very hard work. So I withdrew to the New Economics Foundation, where I was trying to understand why it was that countries that had had no debt before the 1970s, countries like Zambia, Tanzania, countries, Guatemala, had not had any debt before the 19th. Why was it they suddenly became terribly indebted? And so, of course, I just looked at the history, and I had time to think and to read and to write. And I edited a book then, which we called The Real World Economic Outlook, which was a challenge to the IMF, which had produced a World Economic Outlook annually, which was always cheerful, which was always upbeat, which was always positive. And it is particularly positive. The IMF annual reports, they have this characteristic that in the year before a great financial crisis, they are optimistic. They're saying everything is okay. And the sort of the horror of this, excited our imagination. So we produced something called The Real World Economic Outlook. And we invited economists from around the world to contribute. And they did. We had Latin Americans, Africans, Asian economists, as well as American and British and European economists contributed. And in the process of looking at why poor countries had got into this state, I looked at what was happening to the international sphere. I began to look at what was happening to Anglo-American economies, and it became blindingly obvious to me that the $300 billion that we wanted to write off for the low-income countries, and we only succeeded in writing off about 100 billion, was a drop in the ocean compared to the enormous amounts of debt that had been private debt that had been accumulated by the United States and Britain, and mainly Britain. Europe, interestingly, was very different. It was an Anglo-American phenomenon. And that required just sort of looking up from my desk and seeing that the emperor had no clothes, right? Now, you need to know I'm not an academic economist, and Steve has impressed on me that it's not really the place to be, and I have no ambitions to be an academic economist at all. I was working in the real world of sovereign debt, and it just became very clear. But of course, because I wasn't an academic economist, because I wasn't based at the IMF, the World Bank, or the Bank for International Settlements, my book was dismissed. The Real World Economic Outlook, which we published in 2003, was read amongst some of the people who think as we do, but generally it disappeared. And then I began to watch my colleagues and my family and my friends take out credit cards and loans and mortgages as if there was no tomorrow, as if nothing could ever go wrong. And I just developed this enormous panic about what was going to happen to my communities and my families, really, including my son and daughter-in-law. And so I decided to write a book in which I would try and explain A, money, and B, the way the system worked, the international system, and C, the likelihood of how that was going to play out. And I was invited to publish this by Routledge, and my editor, I signed a contract. I am, of course, you know, you sign contracts as new authors and you don't really know what you're doing. And I hadn't really twigged that the publisher would have control of the title of the book. And when it came to the title, she wants to call it The Coming First World Debt Crisis. And I said, oh, I thought that was a terrible title. And I wanted to object to it. She said, no, we've consulted all the salespeople. This is what will sell. And I said, I'm sorry, but you can't do that for two reasons. One, you know, I don't like this framing of first world, third world. I come from Africa. There ain't no such thing as a first world and third world, and I don't like it. There's a high income world and a low income world, not first and third, thank you. Sorry, so it's against my political principles, I said. She just ignored me. And I said, furthermore, if you call it The Coming First World Debt Crisis, when it's published in September 2006, the crisis will have come and my book will be out of date. And she totally ignored me. And that cookie, I owe her big time, because nobody has read my book, I'm pretty sure, but everybody knows the title, and the title has made me famous. So I have to thank her for her commitment to this title. And the book is a modest book. I wrote it for my friends and my neighbors, people who don't understand monetary theory or policy, people who don't live in the world of international debt negotiations and so on. And I'm determined, and it's still my mission. My role is not to write for the BIS or the IMF. They have their experts. My purpose is to write for people like me who want to understand what's going on. And I was very much the little girl in the crowd saying the emperor has no clothes, right? And the book, I have to tell you, at first sunk like a balloon, like a lead balloon, right? It just, nobody bought it, of course. So, and then the thing that really horrified me was that there was no crisis in September 2006. I couldn't believe that the bubble could go on expanding at the rate it did without bursting. I was sure that there was something terribly wrong. And then the other really interesting part of the story was I was here in the countryside in Suffolk on the 9th of August 2007, when it dawned on me that the bubble had burst. Banks had frozen interbank lending. The central banks had rushed out with liquidity. The ECB, the fastest, followed by the Fed. The Bank of England, the governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King, was watching cricket that weekend, so he was a bit slow on the uptake. And this occurred on Saturday, the 9th of August. It is as deeply imprinted in my memory. I had seen rumors in that week before, and indeed I'd written about what was happening, but it was on the 9th of August. I call it Debt Detonation Day. And then everything went quiet. Do you know, I remember going to New York in February 2008, and I had a friend who had invested her savings in the money markets, and someone else, her best friend, had invested in the stock market. And I said to them, do you know there's a financial crisis unfolding as we speak? And they said, well, it's all been sorted, hasn't it? You know, we thought it had been fixed by the banks, the central banks. No, I said, and that friend, she's become one of my dearest friends because she took her money out of the money market. and her friend took money out of the stock markets, and they watched as their friends lost huge sums of money that year. But in February 2008, oh, I've lost you. Where are you?
Hi, Mark.
I'm seeing Marc Faber here.
Yeah, Marc Faber is sharing his screen. Hello, Mark. It's good to see you.
Yes, hi, Pierre.
Sorry,
Hi, hello. Can you let Anne finish before you share your screen?
Okay.
What's happening, Mark? Yeah, they've made us all organisers, so we all have more control than we normally have.
Sorry, Mark. I know it's a little bit complicated. It's very technical, you know.
Don't worry. Now I'm off, right?
Okay. Yep.
So we're back in February 2008, and I'm aware from reading the New York Times that public still does not understand that there's an ongoing great financial crisis. And again, Steve is right about this. I blame the economists and I blame the central bankers, but it was outrageous that people were still gambling, still investing money without proper awareness of the scale of the crisis. And it was only in September, when Lehman's went down, that finally the public got it. And for me, that's the greatest injustice of all of the economics profession, that they allowed that to drag on from the 9th of August 2007 to September 2008 without really, it was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy to hide what was really going on from the public in case people lost money. And of course, in the meantime, people like Paulson at Goldman Sachs was making a lot of money out of it. Was making huge amounts of money out of speculating that the thing would fall down. So that's my story. That's how I came to it, and that's how I continue to work on it.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you so much. I have so many questions. It makes me think about so many things. Thank you for this testimony, for your, for your souvenirs. I'm using the term that Isabelle Strauss-Kahn used, because she also gave her testimony about her recollection, in a way, of the events of 2007 and 8, and what you did was also very similar, and it's very useful because we see the constraints you face, the difficulty about publishing a book, and I think Paul also could say a few words about that. And it's very fascinating. Before we go back to the comments, I'm very happy to welcome Marc Faber. Marc Faber, thank you for joining us. It's good to see you, in person. It's too bad.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, well,
do I share the screen now?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I will try. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to your seminar, Pierre. I know it's a lot of work to organize such a seminar, so I appreciate it. It's especially a lot of work when you're dealing with economists, because economists are slightly more complicated people than ordinary folks who actually work the whole day. But anyway, I want to give you a brief introduction how I became a contrarian. As probably the best way to describe it is through a series of examples. I'd also like to emphasize that to be a contrarian does not necessarily mean to be a bearish person about the future or about asset markets. As a contrarian, you have actually more buying opportunities than actually shorting opportunities. And I want to explain in the following 20 minutes how this all works. I'd like to also mention I started to work now 50 years ago in 1970 on Wall Street. And at the time, we had a boom in so-called quality growth stocks. We had institutional favorite stocks. The market didn't do very much. The overall market between 1968, 69 and 1973. But there was a narrow group of stocks. We called them the Nifty 50 that kept on going up. Altogether, there were roughly 50 stocks. And you can see here the institutional favorites in 72. They subsequently went down in the 73, 74 bear market by much more than the indices. And the same was true of the institutional favorite stocks in 73. You can see Polaroid, Kodak. Another one was at the time Xerox. A lot of these companies eventually disappeared. And after the 1973 peak, they never came back. But as the market came down in 73, 74, another group of stocks emerged. This is the beauty essentially of bubbles. Once they burst, the leadership changes. And I will also discuss in what sense I believe that today the leadership is changing. Anyway, these stocks, they went out of favor. They came down a lot. It also allowed some hedge fund managers to reap huge profits. The first hedge funds were founded in the late 60s, and they were essentially making money in the 70s by shorting stocks, heavily shorting stocks. And these were the brilliant years of Soros, Mike Steinberg, and so forth. So when the market broke in 73, 74, the next big group of stocks and of assets were energy stocks. And you can see a bubble built up until 1980. The energy stocks essentially went up until 1980 from around 73, when the oil price started to increase. But the bubble also burst then. At the time in 1980, energy made up for almost 30% of the S&P 500. So here you can see that some of these energy stocks dropped by more than 90% from the peak to the low. Admittedly, they had gone up a lot before. So all these things, they kind of formed my mind that bubbles eventually do burst. The question is, of course, as a contrarian, if you bet against them and you bet against them too soon, by the time you're right, you've lost all your clients. So I think we have to be objective about being a contrarian. The timing is very important, and it's easier to be a contrarian on the long side of the market by buying stocks when they are depressed than by selling stocks when they are expensive, because what is expensive can become more expensive, whereas what is depressed, the maximum loss is 100%. You understand? I know many people, they've shorted Tesla already at $200. It went through the roof and they lost a ton of money. They're out of business, and their clients as well. So here is the crude oil. This is an interesting example of being a contrarian. In 1973 here, OPEC increased the oil price first to around $3 and then to about $8, $9 a barrel. And the whole world said, oh, the world will go bankrupt at these prices. Never before have oil prices been this high and so forth. What they overlooked is the printing machines of governments. So they printed money, and instead of oil prices falling when they were $9, they kept on going up here until 1980. When oil reached on the spot market $50. I had started to go frequently to the Middle East at the time, and I came to the conclusion that the oil price from $50 would collapse. And we started to short oil. But it wasn't a successful trade, because you can see oil went down gently here, but it didn't collapse. So when you shorted the futures, you were always shorting at the discount. And because of the rollover cost, it essentially was a wash. You didn't make any money. It's only here in 85, 86 that oil completely collapsed. excuse me, and it also bankrupted at that time, not one, but all the Texas banks. All of them went bust. And then you can see oil traded in a range. And then here, by 1998, 1999, the sentiment was extremely negative. The Economist had a negative article about oil and talked about an eternal oil glut and so forth. And at the time, it was my belief, because the technology stocks in the US had been so strong, that oil and other commodities had become undervalued. So that's when I wrote a book about Tomorrow's Gold, which was Asia's Age of Discovery. My theory was that the incremental demand coming from China for oil and other resources would drive up the price of these commodities, and that there would be a big opportunity in commodity-related stocks and in commodities overall. Here you can see, by the way, the price of oil recently. It peaked out in 2008 here, and then at $147 a barrel. And then it went gently down with rallies in between. And then this spring, between March and April, the oil price completely imploded. There was, the problem was in the paper market, because nowadays, because of the money printing by our good central banks, the paper market, in other words, the futures market or the options market, are frequently larger than the physical market. In other words, you have more option trading on, say, Tesla than on the shares, more options outstanding on Tesla than on the shares. And in the futures market, what we had is what I never believed when I grew up as an economist and studied, that the futures price could go below zero. I have people calling me up all excited that their future was now at minus $10, it went to minus $30 at one stage. Anyway, but I think when we talk about contrarian investing, that oil, that was criticized a lot as a source of energy, made a lifetime low here in the physical market around $10 in April of this year, and that from here onwards, oil will go up, and that the French company Total will benefit. So this is how a contrarian may also think. When everybody's bearish about oil and about energy-related issues, that's the time essentially to buy them. Now, here I show you briefly the chart of Schlumberger. As you can see, it collapsed. Then it went down into April, rebounded, and made a second low in October. You will seldom see such an attractive stock chart. So I think that Schlumberger is actually a good investment opportunity for the longer term. The other thing I want to point out in the 70s is the following. Again, on the negative side on the one hand and on the positive on the other side. When I started to work, you can see here, interest rates on 10 years treasuries were around 6%. And they had a rising trend here until 1981. Nobody in the world in 1970 expected interest rates to go up as strongly as they did. There were two people on Wall Street that became famous. One, Henry Kaufman, they called him Dr. Doom. He is the original Dr. Doom because he predicted that the interest rates would go up. But he's still a friend of mine today. He never thought they would go up to over 15% in September 1981. The other person who was very bearish, they called him Dr. Death. That was Al Wojnielauer. He worked at that time for First Boston. He also predicted interest rates to go up, but not to this extent. And then what I just explained before about being a contrarian and buying stuff, in 1981, 82, and 83, it occurred to me that sentiment was extremely negative about bonds globally. And I wrote 2 reports at the time that bonds had become a lifetime buying opportunity. And I can tell you, if you bought bonds in 1981, 82, zero coupon bonds, and kept on rolling them over, you actually made more money than in the stock market. But this was a great opportunity, and I can assure you that in 81, 82, 83, nobody ever dreamt that interest rates would go down to the extent they went down. And if you had asked me when I studied about interest rates, I would never have suggested to you that they could go below 0. And now, thanks to the interventions by the manipulators, the central banks, we have even Portugal at negative interest rates in Europe. This is the complete joke. Portugal and Spain at negative interest rates. Soon it will be Greece, I suppose. But anyway, the point here is there was a generational buying opportunity for fixed interest securities. And I have a bond manager in Switzerland who looks after some of my bond money. And he never bought any bonds, even when they were 4% yield, because he never dreamt that they would go to 0. I told him, you know, you could have at least bought some of them. I don't expect you to put the whole portfolio into 10-year Swiss bonds, or you could have put, say, 30% or so. But anyway, now we are at probably the opposite juncture. You can see here, rates have come down. They're at artificially low interest rates. And probably sooner or later they'll go up. And probably they'll go up the way here they went down much more than expected. I suppose that here they'll go up much more than expected. I don't expect this to happen tomorrow, but maybe in the next few years it will happen. And you can then guess what the consequences will be for the large government debt. When interest rates go up, it will be a complete mess. The other thing that has happened as a result of the decline in interest rates I was just referring to here is that bank stocks have, of course, collapsed. This has also happened in Europe. And let me remind you, the CAC index in Paris is still lower today than it was at the peak in year 2000. These artificially low interest rates have actually hurt banks. But they are now at a very low level. And again, as a contrarian, everybody has been bearish about European banks, Spanish banks. As a contrarian, I say, this is now a buying opportunity. You should invest part of your money in bank stocks in Europe and in emerging markets, and to some extent in the US. The other contrarian play I experienced in my life is here. You can see the Nikkei, it went up strongly between the 1950s and the peak in 1989 at close to 40,000 on the Nikkei. At that time, Japan made up for 50% of the stock market capitalization in the world. And I turned very bearish on Japan. Of course, I was attacked by all kinds of people because they said, oh, Japan has this and that, and they will own all the banks in the world, and so forth and so on. But I stuck to my belief. I was surprised that actually Japan went down more than I expected. I expected it to drop by 50%, but it then dropped by close to 80%, the banks even more. But that was a contrarian play, and I want to explain here something that is very important. after the 2000 peak in technology stocks, everything went down. The technology sector went down. By the way, Cisco, the high priest of technology, is still lower today by close to 50% than it was at the peak in year 2000. The Japanese market went down, but while the Japanese market went down, other markets in the world went up, emerging markets, in particular Latin America, between 1987 and 1994, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, all went up by approximately 30 times. So there was an opportunity in Latin America after the 1970s because everything was very depressed. And I started to travel to Latin America and looking at opportunities in countries like Peru, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And when I went to a to a Swiss private bank in Geneva and told them you should buy Argentina in 1986, they said, no, this is a country we only take money out. So I said, you mean it like you only take money out of France? The contrarian profession has become more difficult because of the endless money printing of not just one central bank, all of them in a concentrated, concerted effort to boost asset prices. They live from asset inflation. They know the asset markets go down, it will be a disaster. And they have managed to inflate asset markets. You can see here the stock market capitalization of the US as a percent of the economy is in the sky. This is when I started to work in the 1970s. At that time, wages were high relative to assets. So it wasn't my genius that I became affluent. It was just the timing that I could buy bonds at 7% compound, and I could buy stocks at less than book value, whereas now everything is relatively expensive. You can also see here the US stock and bond market capitalization as a percent of the economy is also at the highest level ever compared to the 70s when we were down here. So basically we are at a high level, but I think what is happening or will happen is that the US stock market will go down because it's heavily weighted into technology, and other markets like emerging markets, European markets, and value stocks in particular will go up. You can see here the US, or the better said, the United Kingdom FTSE index compared to the S&P is at the lowest ever since the 1960s. The same I could show about the CAC index. It's at the very lowest level compared to the S&P 500 in the US. And you can see here the valuation of US stocks is at the highest against all developed markets. So there is an opportunity in emerging markets in Europe. Here you have the FANG stocks, the market capitalization. It's not that everything has gone up in the US. A lot of companies in the sector of energy, in the sector of banking, in resources, they are depressed. But what has pushed the index up are, say, 7 or 10 stocks that have gone ballistic. That's where the bubble is. Here you have the New York FANG index. It also includes not only Facebook, Amazon, Apple, but also Tesla. And it's, in my opinion, peaking out against value stocks, against emerging market stocks. Then we had a bear market since 2015 in precious metals. It bottomed out in December 2015, and since then they started to move up. Gold has outperformed silver and platinum until recently, but that is maybe now changing. So I think there is still an opportunity in the bull market for precious metals and a bull market for other commodities, in particular, the cheapest commodities even after their recent increase, are agricultural commodities. Here I have the price of platinum compared to gold. It's never been this low in the last 100 years. This is a buying opportunity in platinum compared to gold. Bitcoins is another thing. I missed the rise until here, the peak in 2017. But then in 2018, when the price was around 3,000, I wrote a report that you should invest at least a little bit of your money in Bitcoins, the money that you can afford to lose, because the economics of Bitcoins, like precious metals, are favorable in a money printing environment. I'd like to conclude my presentation with the following words. It's painful at times to be a contrarian. You know, people like Jeremy Grantham and so forth, they sometimes lost 70% of their clients by having a value approach and not investing in growth stocks. But frequently you need to be a contrarian also on the bullish side. When everybody's bearish about something, you can sometimes argue the opposite. And that's where actually the bigger money is than on the short side of the markets. I thank you very much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Pierre. So I will be very brief because, as you say, I think it's a question. It's better to open questions to the audience. No, I think I thank you all for these fascinating presentations. I mean, we already had like a midterm discussion at the beginning where we were discussing the, you know, how to call, you know, whether we should call prophets, Cassandra, whistleblowers. So I think we see that the situations are very different. Marc also presented situations where actually you can benefit from, you know, being a contrarian. You can benefit on the market. In the other example that he mentions are Kaufman or George Soros, who actually were saying or thinking, were having some views that were contrary to most people, and in some ways anticipated a crisis, and actually they benefit from this financially. I think it's in that way, it was not a not spoken position, of course, because it was kind of information that was willingly kept private in order to make profit, which is quite also different from the positions we heard at the beginning. So yeah, I will maybe have two other questions. So first is so all of you you know, presented the reasons why you started to think about the imbalances in the world of something that was not going on very well, and you anticipated that there could be a crisis or a bust. But I think it's pretty sure and that you did not fully anticipated what happens. I mean, Anne Petitfort gave us a good example that actually she expected something going on in 2006. It suddenly came in 2007 and not fully, and it's only in 2008 that the crisis became very severe and international. And I think that it's also interesting to reflect on your view. You anticipated that something was not going well, but you know, what were also the mistakes that you did, and how can you reflect on those mistakes? Okay, what do they say about maybe your methodology or your views, or what does it say also about the state of the world and also the kind of knowledge that you had access to, and so on? So it is a kind of obvious question, but I think that it may be a good start, and it's obviously a question to everybody, all of you here.
Should we have those in sequence? May then Anne, then Mark, in the same speaking order. My biggest mistake was underestimating the scale of the government response to the crisis, and also not realizing that would actually be largely done through restarting one of the asset bubbles that was causing the crisis in the first place, which is the housing bubble. So I first of all got caught up in a throwaway comment about housing bubbles and that expecting a Japanese outcome for the Australian market. The Japanese market fell 40% in the first 15 years after the bubble burst in 1990 and 70% by the time house prices bottomed out. So I made that claim, and that became all I became known for in a real estate obsessed country. And then the government trebled the amount of money it gave as a grant to first home buyers, people buying their first home. And in one part of the country with state help as well, they pretty much gave somebody 30% of the price of the house, which of course means you could have no deposit and put down a 30% deposit. That restarted the bubble. And then the only country in the world that avoided a crisis was my home country. And I copped rubbish over that. Mark, you weren't here for the presentation, but I spoke on the leading current affairs program of Australia, the 7:30 report, one day for half the show. You normally only had 4 minutes, I got 15, with the host taking me through my analysis of private debt dynamics causing a crisis and how that was the problem. And he then savaged the Prime Minister the next day, specifically asking me about him. And about a week later, they released their new government program, which, as well as a lot of government stimulus that I supported, also doubled and trebled the housing grant and made a mockery of my prediction and also, of course, made a mockery of the economy in the long term as well. Anne. You're muted, mate.
Sorry.
Oh,
I think I'm with Steve that I underestimated the response from the establishment. The other thing that I still get wrong is that the understanding of money is virtually absent. I listened yesterday to the governor of the bank, the ex-governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, who's delivering the Wreath lectures on the BBC. And yesterday he gave his second lecture. I actually happened to be in on the lecture when it was actually delivered. And I asked him a question which I noticed the BBC did not include. And it was this: he said that banks act as intermediaries between borrowers and savers. And, you know, it's quite extraordinary. I remember Tim Geithner saying exactly the same thing in February 2008. And I think that underestimation, I understood the public didn't know how the system worked, but actually the establishment doesn't know how the system works. And also there is very little grasp of monetary economics amongst not just professional economists, professional bankers, but also commercial bankers. I remember once sitting next to a banker and talking about real interest rates, what they were in real terms, and he didn't understand what I meant, because he thought interest rates were low relative to inflation. So I think it's that underestimation. And so on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the absolute determination of the City of London to not budge an inch, basically, and to demand that the taxpayer bail them out, and that they. So I don't think I don't know if it's a mistake. It's certainly a misjudgment that I didn't grasp the scale of the power of both Wall Street and the City of London to not only bail themselves out, you know, survive the crisis, but then get enormous government revenues effectively in the form of central bank liquidity to allow them to carry on as before. And, you know, and I have to say that I watched the Labour government, which I was a supporter of, bring in the bankers to advise them on how to deal with the crisis. And you watch them walk through the door of number 10 and of the Bank of England as advisors about how you're going to help me out, mates, and how you're going to bail me out, me and my clients. And they couldn't believe their luck. And I think I still don't fully estimate the scale of the ignorance on the one hand, which enables the establishment to be captured, if you like, by the financiers, and B, the power of the financiers. You know, we haven't budged an inch. You know, they are more powerful now. God, they are now getting money doled out to them. Apple has been given some enormously low interest loan effectively. I mean, you know, the central bank has bought its bonds, clearing up its balance sheet, enabling it to borrow even more, when actually it's awash with cash. These guys can't believe they've just had money thrown at them. And the public has nothing to say about that. The politicians have nothing to say about that. And I think we made more progress than we had, and that was a very big mistake. We haven't made progress.
Right. Okay, I'll move in. I don't, in the same way as that with the initial little speech, I had not much to add to what Steve had just said. In the same way, I don't have much to add apart from details to what Anne has just said. My error is being too naive. It's the same thing. There's one little technical thing which it won't mean to, and refer to the money market. My error is that when there was a big collapse, I didn't see the crash of the money market coming, which actually became the trigger of the whole collapse. The other thing where I was wrong was just about that thing about the bailout. We knew that AIG had insured something like a really large portion of the CDS's credit default swaps, and maybe 80% of the market. We knew that they had $8 billion in reserves, and on the day it collapsed, of course, it was right away, I think it was 75 billion that were needed, even much more colossal. And at the end of the week, I think we ended up with something like 165 billion. And I think Mark was also watching this very, very carefully. We wondered how much do the people who insured on CDS, how much would they get back on how many cents on the dollar? Because that's what happens in a bankruptcy. And what we didn't see coming is that that all governments would bail out the whole financial business with taxpayers' money. I didn't believe. I mean, I had been working already into 18 years in the banking sector, but I didn't think the financiers would have the nerve to do that. There was a rumor. I'd like to know one day whether that was a true piece of information or not, in France at the time, which was that the French government had told the American government that if there was no total bailout of AIG, that some bankers would risk being jail sentences, and that was enough to move the American government. I really like to know that, because I mean there was something that I think the person who started the rumor was a person who was well located in order to know really if that was the case. The reason I didn't believe they would bail out the AIG was because something like about 50 of the positions were purely speculative. They were just directional bets between banks, and there was no way that they should have asked the public. That was just a private jokes between banks, that they would ask the taxpayer of the whole world to pay for that. That was just scandalous, because these are, we use for the first time the notion of trillion of dollars. Why would the people of the world? It's the same issue that Anne was raising about the third world, that she doesn't want to call that way. The poor, let's say the poor. Why would I was at some point in the subprime business, the profit margin in the subprime market, mortgage market, when you were pricing a loan, the profit margin was 2% and it was 1% in prime. This is just scandals, but these scandals keep coming, and they're still there. And I mean, my mistake was I didn't think they would have the nerve to ask the public to pay for speculative positions, which was just, as I said, they were just private jokes between traders within banks in order to make some more money. They should have gone down with that. So, okay, let me finish with one little error. I called it la crise du capitalisme américain, the crisis of American capitalism. I should have called it of global capitalism, but little did I know they would be so. I don't want to use the term. Thank you.
Sorry for missing out you earlier, Paul. My apologies.
Well, on this, it's just jumping on your last sentence. It's related to what you said, that you did not anticipate what happened in the money market, so that you remain interested in the subprime market in the US, but did not fully go deep into understanding the interbank market between Europe and the US, which I think was not your background at the time, because you were involved.
No, that's not it. It's because there were so many moving parts. There were so many things that were sinking in sync that it was very difficult, I think, to see which would be the weakest in the whole organization, because it's a very big. It's a complicated, very complex mechanism, all these things which relate to each other. No, what I meant was just within that particular week, I didn't think it would be the money market, but as I said, that's a quite technical point, because there were many other things that were going on. It's just about the, how would I say, the chronology within the week of September 15. I don't think it has any more macroeconomic consequences than just within that particular week.
Thank you. So maybe Marc Faber will also want to.
Well, my answer is very simple. I was fortunate not to make any mistakes in 2007 to 2009, because I had made so many mistakes before. I thought that after the crash in 1987, there would be a serious recession. So I didn't cover my shorts at the time. And then, you know, the market didn't go up a lot, but it closed the year 1987 on the upside. Of course, we had gone up first by more than 40% until the peak in August, or August 27th, 1987. Then we dropped 42%, but then we recovered it all. And then I had a big short position in 98, 99 in US tech stocks. And that was then really painful. And when I saw that the Fed and the Treasury Department bailed out LTCM, that was my warning signal. Don't short against the authorities. They're going to print and print. And then I had a relatively short position, small short positions in 2007. But when it came to December 2008, the markets had gone down for essentially close to 2 years. I noticed that in October 2008, the Chinese stock market had bottomed out and had started to go up, as well as some other emerging economies. But the US market continued to go down until March 6, 2009. S&P 666. And I remember very well, on that day, they called me from Bloomberg. I said, this is the most oversold market I've seen since the low in October 1987. The market was very oversold. I say it's a buying opportunity. And I want to explain why. When Ben Bernanke launched QE1 in December 2008, people said, oh, it's QE1 and they'll take back the expansion of the balance sheet. That's what I said. Once you embark on money printing, because I have a very good book, it's actually, I have it here. It's called The Economics of Inflation by Bresciano Turoni. This is a book every one of you has to read, because he was an economist at the time of the German hyperinflation. And he describes the impact of money printing on society, on wealth inequality, on stock prices, on the foreign exchange, on precious metals prices and everything. And when I saw this Bernanke, who I don't regard to be a particularly smart person, Ray Dalio called him a hero. He's nothing but a hero, because a hero sacrifices himself. He sacrificed actually the small guys' money for the wealth of Wall Street. Well, but anyway, when I saw this QE1, I said to myself, this is Q infinity, and it will go on and on and on. And we're still there. In fact, we will have to accelerate the money printing and the fiscal expenditures until the whole system collapses. But until then, it's difficult to take the short side. The dollar, in my opinion, is the short of the century here.
Maybe if I can intervene, I will just maybe, John, follow one of the remarks of Paul about risk management models. And it's true that after the crisis, the models were taken as part of the culprit. And it's true, good risk management needs to take into account, as we usually say, the knowns that we know, the unknowns that we don't know, and the unknowns that we do not know. And at that time, it was not looking at the unknowns that we do not know. And I think on this side, there have been a lot of progress. And as an anecdote, I remember in 2007, in August, when BNP closed its 3 funds, we immediately had a meeting with all the French banks. And I was effectively really amazed on how they didn't know how to price this. They were just thinking that, well, it was the price as it is, that it will go on like this, but there was no stress testing, there was nothing like that. So it is a point, I think, nevertheless, on which there has been a lot of progress since 2008. The second is maybe a remark to Marc. As a former central banker, I will not call central banks as manipulators. And second, in the mandate of the central bank, it's not, they don't have a mandate to control, to monitor asset prices. So this is, and going further on contrarians, I think you are right. Contrarians are good. And I will maybe give also another anecdote where it was a bit strange in the behavior of central banks. At what point they were injected liquidity during the crisis for the monetary policy, the liquidity of the market and everything. On the other side, and I was also responsible for foreign exchange reserve management, you could see that central banks were depositing, investing their reserves in commercial banks' deposit. And at what point they all stopped and they went to place their money to either the BIS or to other central banks. So on one side we were putting money, on the other side we were withdrawing money. But it comes then to my question. Do you think that contrarians can really help stabilizing the market and could have done more to stabilize the market during the financial crisis?
To whom is the question to?
To you.
To me?
Yeah.
All of us.
As all of you, as a contrarian.
Well, I want to say this. I do not think that authorities who are actually not really elected by the people, central banks haven't been created for the simple man on the street. They've been created for the wealthy elites, that they should intervene into the marketplace and stabilize markets. They shouldn't. It would have been much better. And a lot of pain would not, and a lot of problems would not exist today had LTCM been allowed to fail. That would have been an example of market forces regulating the economy. Instead, they intervened, after LTCM, then they kept monetary policy relatively easy and created the bubble. Actually, Greenspan himself said that this technology bubble would actually foster innovation. That is to some extent true, because we have a lot of new issues during a boom as we have now, and it allows new technologies to come up. But then after the break of the NASDAQ, interest rates were kept artificially low. And at the time, you may remember, some people, including Krugman, said, well, the best for the US economy would be to have another bubble. So they created a housing bubble deliberately. And I have been in 2009, 2010 to areas of Atlanta and other cities. And I've seen how poor people had been evicted from their homes. They lost everything because of the irresponsible policies of a central banker. And that you defend central banks, having been a central banker, I can well understand. I can understand you. I would do the same if I had been a central banker, except my ambition in life was never to be a central banker. And certainly not to work for the Fed. That is, in my opinion, an organization that has no independence at all, none. A former central banker, voting member of the Fed, said to me, Mark, the government in the US, the Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve is one and the same. And when I asked Greenspan, I worked with him at White Well. He's kind of a friend of mine, not someone I go out drinking at night. And now we can't even do that. But I asked him once on a panel, Alan, if you look back at your career of so many years, would you have done anything differently? And then, as he always says, he mumbles around the subject endlessly. But then I nailed him down. I said, you just said that something to the effect that the central bank was not independent. You said that they had to do certain things under the conditions. And he said, Mark, I never ever said that the Federal Reserve is independent. That was his answer, never ever, which is true. He's a smart guy. They are not independent.
About the models and especially the risk management models. As I said, I was at the time of the collapse, I was in the risk management department of Countrywide Financial, and we had the risk. Yeah, and the risk management team, the assessment of the position of the bank was led by an extremely good guy, a Chinese mathematics PhD. I mean, I've never heard anything he would say which was wrong. And at the time of the collapse, we knew it would happen, within 48 hours or something. And there was no flashing lights. There was no ringing bells. There was nothing. There were no sirens at all. We were at the time that Countrywide went down, we were 99.99% perfectly hedged on all positions. The weakness of these models was, of course, the fact that any of these models, and I don't Isabel suggested may have changed, that there are historical data somewhere as being the data that being fed on and with some kind of optimization or trends being produced out of it. The latency in the market is such that you can't really see it happening, even with if you add some indices which are linked to volatility or things like that can act as a kind of predictor of something going really wrong. But why are these models so bad? And that we we go back to what we said in the very beginning, is because the economic models behind it are wrong. They're not good. And that's, I see Steve nodding. And that's why it doesn't work. There's nobody there having a perfect representation of the mechanism, of the moving parts precisely. And that's the weakness. But until people like us are, so long as people like us are barred from having real impact of what things will be, the weaknesses will remain exactly the same. We have to really build something on the side and convince someone somewhere that that's what the place where to look to have a proper representation. I've worked in 18 years in banks. I hardly met anybody there who had a real representation of the overall mechanism behind what they were doing. Everybody knew just rules of thumb, things, formulas they had learned. People believed that a forward rate was some kind of prediction, things that if you have some understanding of how it works, you would never say some of that. But that's what you hear in the business school. That's what you hear in the faculty of economics. Until that changes, I don't think we can make any progress at all.
I want to agree very much with Paul and say to Mark that I agree with him that on certain things that there is no such thing as an independent central bank. It's blindingly obvious. They're all civil servants. They're paid by the state. They are a government department. The fact that there is some distance between the politician and the central bank is, for me, a healthy thing. I've worked in Nigeria where there is no difference. There's no distance between the central bank and the politicians. And the politicians just raid the central bank for dollars, for hard currency. So we need a little bit of technocratic aloofness. I'm not against that, but it's ridiculous to say that central banks are independent. But the second point I want to make is this. It comes out, as Paul says, of the ideology of economics, which is that the market is the best. The market is best at deciding. The market is best for governing the economy. Don't rely on the state to govern the economy. Rely entirely on the markets to govern the economy. And the central banks have bought into this. They see their mission as not defending the people of the United States or of Britain or the poor people. That's not their mission. Their mission is to defend the market, because after all, the market is running the show, right? And you've got to keep the market alive. You've got to keep it reinflating this dead body. Because otherwise, how would we function? Because only the market can enable us. And that, for me, is the crime that central banks are committing. They are actually creating markets. You know, they built the repo market. They're actually providing the assets that the market needs to leverage additional debt and finance that's coming from the central bank, is dealing in this stuff, right? So the central banks are in the markets for the markets. And that is a consequence, as Paul says, of economic ideology. And until we get the economists to change that, and like Paul, I'm shocked at the ignorance of people working in finance, but I don't think it's an accident. I think it's deliberate. Can you imagine if you were an aeronautical engineer and you were responsible for preventing people from being killed by an airplane, whether you wouldn't have sound physics as your background, right? And whether that physics hadn't taught you about the laws of gravity. Economics does not even teach bankers about the nation, about the notion, the creation of credit and the notion of money. The central bank governor of Britain believes that bankers are intermediaries between savers and borrowers, that you can only lend as much as there is in the vaults of the bank, that somebody puts their savings in there and somebody else dishes them out. There's no such thing as credit creation, you know, and if you have that level of ignorance at that high level, it won't help us really. But I think I come back to the ideology of the market. And this is where I think Quinn Slobodian of Harvard is so right, that the Hayekians and the Milton Friedmans created this determination to enclose markets, to encase them, to protect them from democratic intervention by the state, right? And the thing that inspires me about the Roosevelt era is when Henry Morgenthau wrote that actually we moved the government, he says, we moved it from Wall Street and London to my desk at the Treasury, right? And that was the state, the democratic state, taking over the running of the economy and stripping Wall Street of that power. Now, we need a politician with that kind of courage. We don't have that. He did that, by the way, on the night of his inauguration. He didn't wait. On the night of his inauguration, he wanted to close the banks, and they told him he couldn't close the banks because it was a Sunday, it was a holy day. So he had to wait till Monday. That's how urgent he considered it to bring Wall Street under control, really. And until we get that kind of political and intellectual courage, you know, central bankers are going to go on being compromised and embarrassed and corrupted, frankly. Sorry, Isabella, I didn't mean that to be personal.
I'll try to bring a brief tale. And I think I support virtually everybody's comments here. And in particular, I want to add to Anne's that what you have is a bunch of technocrats who have a theory of the world which is neat, plausible, and completely wrong. And that, with that compass guiding them, that's why they've been crashing on reefs all the time when they thought they were sailing in the deep ocean. So this is all about a vision about capitalism reaching equilibrium, as if that's desirable and as if that's any particular feature of a capitalist system. It's ludicrous. So with that ideology, they think markets are always correct. So how can they crash? And then that was really, in some ways, the beginning of the Greenspan put. I would actually take it, not LTCM, market, take it right back to the Greenspan put, when he guaranteed nobody was going to fold effectively out of the 20% fall of the market in October on one day. So that meant they were then said what I called a pact with the devil, you know, Mephistopheles signs. You can never pull out of that contract. So ever since then, they've been inflating the asset markets. And what they have at their disposal is not, we say taxpayers' money. It's not taxpayers' money. It's money they create by double entry bookkeeping. So if the Fed said they're going to buy $1 trillion worth of bonds off Wall Street, 80 billion per month, which was the beginning of QE, all they have to do is enter the number 80 billion each month in the bank account of the banks they're buying the money off, those accounts of the central bank. And then they record the 80 billion they've bought as an asset the central bank now owns. Now their capacity to do that is basically infinite. And that's what's been driving markets up.
Well, that's not taxpayers' money. They can only do it because they're backed by taxpayers. Because they're not taxing the taxpayer, Anne. Okay, yeah. That's the point. Nobody paid a tax for QE. Okay, it was several $1 trillion. Nobody paid a cent in taxes. So it's a mistake to say it's taxpayers' money.
Sorry, if I can enter the discussion, just to be clear, because you said, Steve and Anne, you said that on several things you agreed with Mark, but I thought that you will not agree with what he said regarding the stabilizing impact of some investors, because if I understood well, so Mark suggested that actually it's because of the central bank, and the central bank, I'm okay to criticize central bank, but I'm not sure that the market will be more stabilizing.
You know, I'm a developer of Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, so I hardly expect markets to reach equilibrium. But I take Mark's point that if we hadn't had the rescue back in '87, I think the bubble would have burst right back then.
Can I say that I mean, I agree with Mark on certain points, but I don't agree with Mark on the inflation point. And I think inflation is often misunderstood.
Yeah.
I do think it was driven by the central bank. It was crazy. I do think that it was used to inflate the value of assets. But I think if you think that inflation is simply a function of money printing, you don't understand inflation. I mean, inflation, the thing about Weimar is that they had full employment. They had decent wages. Admittedly, the wages had to rise all the time in line with the currency. But the fact of the matter was they had a certain level of stability because they had full employment. And the inflation comes when you have full employment and excess activity, excess beyond the boundaries, beyond the capacity of the economy. And so you can't ask markets to, in a sense, to do that. And you can't ask the central bank to do it. That has to be a matter for policy. That has to be a matter for stimulating private as well as public investment to to restore activity. Only then will you get some stability. You're not going to get stability from the financial, or equilibrium from investors or from the financial markets. You're going to get it from policy and real economic activity.
Yeah, you need the authorities to prevent the businesses just to rising the prices because the wages have gone up, and that will be the people say, well, it's automatic if you raise the wages that there will be inflation. No, only if the consumer prices go up at the same time. So that will mean businesses to make a bit less profit, but that's never raises a possibility even.
But the point also is, Paul, that in Britain, we had inflation when we got credit deregulation. After 1973, with so-called competition and control, the regulation of what lending banks could do and what they could do it for was lifted. And banks were left to decide that they said, let the price of the money decide how much I should lend, right? So therefore it becomes, in that sense, that important for the market to lend to the riskiest borrower because they're going to pay 15%. The price is going to be the highest. And that transformation happened in 73. So you had too much credit feeding into, if you like, prices and wages. And it was that easy money which in first instance stimulated, and sound like I'm contradicting myself here, but that's what in Britain, the way the system worked, it was the deregulation of the banks that began the credit inflation. And that credit inflation then fed into price inflation and wage inflation.
I do remember, because at the time when I became a graduate student at Cambridge.
All right, yes, you would have been there.
It was exactly that, yeah.
Sorry, I need to jump in. This is a fascinating conversation. It really shows that the 2008 financial crisis is still an open case, and it's still very much open to interpretation and debate. And I'm really glad that you don't agree on everything. And that was one of the goals of this session, is to also highlight differences between you. There are different theoretical background, and this is, unfortunately, we need to close because we have another session at 4:30. Ariel Veil, who is one of the mayors in Paris, one of the Paris mayors, is going to give a speech. The interesting thing about Ariel Veil is he used to work for Moody's, the rating agency, and he was in charge during the 2008 financial crisis. And he will give his recollection of how the crisis was perceived by Moody's back in 07-08. As for me, I'm a little bit disappointed by the fact that the conversation went so well, is because I had so many questions for you. I think I know you pretty good. You don't know me necessarily, but I wrote papers on financial prophecies or contrarian economist, and I collected a lot of information about you, about your biographies, what you published and everything. And I had so many questions to ask you about, your life before the crisis, during the crisis, after the crisis. I don't know, if you don't mind, I will maybe continue the conversation by sending you an email, or I don't know. But as for now, I really wish to thank you again for participating in this event. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Anne, Steve, Paul. Thank you also to the discussants, Isabelle and Eric, who represented the central banking side. And I think the debate was really interesting. So thank you all again for participating.